The courtroom was unusually quiet for a Monday afternoon. Judge Graham Calloway, known for his measured demeanor and sharp intellect, sat behind the towering bench, his gavel resting nearby. The next case on the docket was a custody hearing involving a young boy named Jalen Hartwell. Graham glanced at the case file, noting the names of the individuals involved. It seemed straightforward, a dispute between the boy's foster care agency and a distant relative who claimed guardianship rights. "Call the next case," Graham instructed the bailiff, his deep voice carrying through the courtroom. As Jalen Hartwell's name was announced, a quiet murmuring began among the sparse audience. A slim, sharp-eyed boy stepped forward, accompanied by his social worker, Ms. Rhea Johnson. Jalen looked around the courtroom, his gaze steady despite his obvious nervousness. He was 12 years old, with an air of maturity that came from living through more hardships than most adults. "Good afternoon, Jalen," Graham said, offering a slight nod. "Please take a seat." The proceedings began as expected, with Ms. Johnson presenting the agency's position. The boy's foster situation was temporary, and they were considering a transfer to a relative out of state. Jalen listened in silence, his posture rigid, his hands clasped tightly on the table. Graham noted the boy's composure, unusual for someone so young in such an intimidating setting. When Ms. Johnson finished, Graham turned to Jalen. "Do you have anything you'd like to say?" he asked, his tone kind but firm. Jalen hesitated for a moment, then stood. His gaze locked with Graham's, and something in his expression made the judge pause. It wasn't defiance or fear, it was determination. "I do, Your Honor," Jalen said, his voice steady. "But it's not about what she just said. It's about you." The courtroom fell silent. Even Ms. Johnson looked puzzled. Graham frowned, his curiosity piqued. "Go on," he said. Jalen took a deep breath. "I think you're my dad." The words hung in the air, shocking everyone in the room. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the small audience. Graham's grip on his gavel tightened, but his face remained composed. "Jalen," Graham said carefully, "that's a serious claim. What makes you think that?" The boy reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn photograph. His hands trembled slightly as he placed it on the table for the bailiff to bring to Graham. The judge leaned forward to examine it, his heart skipping a beat as he recognized the image. The photo showed a younger version of himself standing beside a woman he hadn't thought about in years, Leona Hartwell. Graham felt a rush of emotions, shock, confusion, and a pang of guilt. Leona had been a part of his life over a decade ago, a brief relationship that ended when she moved away. She had never mentioned being pregnant. "She told me my dad's name was Graham," Jalen said, his voice quieter now. "When I saw your name in the court papers, I thought, maybe it's you." Graham stared at the photo, his mind racing. Could it be true? He looked up at the boy, seeing flashes of familiarity in his face, the shape of his jaw, the intensity in his eyes. It was too much to process all at once. "Court is recessed," Graham announced abruptly, banging his gavel. He stood and motioned for Ms. Johnson and Jalen to follow him to his chambers, his usually calm exterior showing cracks. Once inside the privacy of his office, Graham faced them. "Ms. Johnson, is this the first time you've heard of this?" he asked, his voice tinged with urgency. "Yes, Your Honor," Ms. Johnson replied, her expression equally bewildered. Jalen mentioned wanting to speak during the hearing, but he didn't say why. Graham turned to the boy, who stood awkwardly in the center of the room. "Jalen," he said, softening his tone, "I'm not saying I don't believe you. But this is something we need to verify. We'll need to do a DNA test." Jalen nodded quickly. "I understand. I had to tell you." Graham sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Okay. We'll arrange the test. In the meantime, I want you to know that no matter what the results say, you've shown incredible bravery today." The boy's eyes brightened slightly at the compliment. "Thank you, sir. As Ms. Johnson led Jalen out of the chambers, Graham sat heavily in his chair, the photo still clutched in his hand. His mind was a whirlwind of questions. Had Leona hidden this from him? What had her life, and Jalen's, been like all these years? And, most importantly, what would he do if the boy's claim turned out to be true? The weight of the moment settled over him, but beneath the shock was a flicker of something unexpected: hope. If Jalen was his son, Graham had a second chance to be the father he never knew he could be. The days following Jalen's revelation were a whirlwind of emotions for Judge Graham Calloway. For years, Graham had lived a structured, predictable life, built around his career and a quiet sense of solitude. Now, the possibility that he had a son, a child he had never known about, threatened to upend everything he thought he understood about himself. Graham immediately arranged for a DNA test, coordinating with Ms. Johnson and the agency overseeing Jalen's care. The lab promised expedited results, but the wait was excruciating. Graham found himself unable to focus on his cases, his thoughts repeatedly circling back to Jalen's earnest face and the worn photograph he had presented. He couldn't stop looking at that photo. It sat on his desk in his study at home, a constant reminder of a chapter in his life he thought was closed. Leona Hartwell had been a vibrant, intelligent woman with a sharp wit that had captivated him instantly. Their relationship had been brief but meaningful, at least to Graham. When Leona had moved away, she hadn't told him why, and Graham, busy with his burgeoning legal career, hadn't pursued it further. Now he wondered if she had been protecting a secret all along. Meanwhile, Jalen stayed in his current foster placement, though Ms. Johnson allowed supervised visits between him and Graham. Their first meeting outside the courtroom took place at a local park. Graham arrived early, his nerves frayed as he tried to imagine how to approach the boy. He had spent his life commanding courtrooms, yet here he was, unsure of what to say to a 12-year-old. Jalen arrived with Ms. Johnson, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket. He looked smaller outside the formal setting of the courtroom, more like a vulnerable child than the composed boy Graham had seen during the hearing. "Hey, Jalen," Graham greeted, forcing a smile as he gestured to a nearby bench. "Thanks for meeting me." Jalen shrugged but followed him to the bench. They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of children playing on the swings and the rustle of leaves filling the air. "So," Graham began, clearing his throat, "what do you like to do for fun?" Jalen glanced at him, one eyebrow raised. "Fun?" "Yes," Graham said, a little awkwardly. "Hobbies, interests. You know, things you enjoy." Jalen hesitated, then shrugged again. "I like puzzles. And reading about history. My mom used to say I was good at figuring things out." The mention of Leona hit Graham like a wave. "Your mom, she was a good person," he said softly. "She never told me about you, but I wish she had." Jalen studied him carefully. "Do you think she had a reason not to?" Graham paused, considering his answer. "I don't know. But if she did, it doesn't change the fact that I'm here now. I want to get to know you, Jalen. And if the test confirms what we think, I want to be there for you." Jalen's eyes flickered with something Graham couldn't quite read, hope, maybe, or cautious optimism. "You mean that?" "I do," Graham said firmly. "I don't take this lightly." The boy nodded but said nothing more. Graham let the silence stretch, sensing that Jalen needed time to process everything. Over the next few visits, they began to establish a tentative bond. Graham brought Jalen a book about ancient civilizations after learning about his love for history. Jalen, in turn, started to relax a little, sharing snippets about his life with his mother and his experiences in the foster system. Graham listened intently, his heart breaking at the struggles Jalen had faced. One evening, as Graham sat at home reviewing case files, his phone buzzed. It was Ms. Johnson. "The DNA results are in," she said. Graham's heart skipped a beat. "And you're a match," she confirmed. Jalen is your biological son. Graham leaned back in his chair, the weight of the revelation crashing over him. Relief, joy, and guilt tangled together in his chest. He had a son, a smart, brave boy who had faced so much on his own. And now it was up to Graham to step into a role he had never anticipated, fatherhood. He called Ms. Johnson back. "I'd like to meet with Jalen tomorrow," he said. "This time, I want to tell him myself." The following day, they met at the park again. Jalen arrived, his expression unreadable as he sat beside Graham on the bench. Graham took a deep breath, his hands resting on his knees. "Jalen," he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion, "the DNA test came back. It's confirmed, you're my son." Jalen blinked, his lips parting in surprise. "Really?" "Really," Graham said, a small smile breaking through. "And I want you to know how sorry I am that I wasn't there for you before. If I had known, things would have been different." Jalen stared at the ground, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his jacket. "So, what happens now?" Graham straightened. "Now, we figure it out together. I want to be part of your life, Jalen. For real." For the first time, Jalen looked up, a tentative smile forming on his face. "Okay," he said softly. "I think I'd like that." In that moment, Graham felt a deep sense of purpose settle over him. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let Jalen down. This was just the beginning of their journey, and Graham was ready to take every step alongside his son. The days following the DNA confirmation were transformative for both Graham and Jalen. Knowing that they were father and son gave their interactions a new depth, but it also brought challenges. They were still learning about each other, and the path to building a meaningful relationship was not without its hurdles. Graham decided to take a few days off from work to focus on Jalen. It was a rare move for the dedicated judge, but he knew this time was crucial. He wanted to create opportunities to bond, to show Jalen that he wasn't just a figure in a courtroom but someone who genuinely cared about him. Their first day together was spent exploring the city. Graham thought it would be a good idea to show Jalen some of his favorite spots, places that had shaped his own life. They started at the public library, where Graham often went as a young boy to escape into books. Jalen's eyes lit up as they walked through the grand hall lined with towering shelves. "Wow," Jalen said, his voice filled with awe. "This place is huge." "It is," Graham agreed with a smile. "I used to spend hours here reading about history, just like you. Want to take a look around?" Jalen nodded eagerly, and they spent the next hour browsing books on ancient civilizations and world history. Jalen was particularly drawn to a book about the pyramids of Egypt. As they checked it out, Graham promised, "We can come back any time you want." Their next stop was a nearby park with a small pond and a walking trail. Graham brought a basketball, hoping to break the ice with some casual play. Jalen was hesitant at first, unsure of his skills, but Graham's encouragement eventually coaxed him into the game. As they passed the ball back and forth, Jalen's laughter began to fill the air, a sound Graham realized he hadn't heard enough of. "You're not bad for an old guy," Jalen teased after sinking a shot. Graham laughed. "Don't get cocky. I'm just warming up." That evening, they cooked dinner together, something simple, spaghetti and meatballs. Jalen admitted he didn't know much about cooking, so Graham took the opportunity to teach him. They joked about Jalen's clumsy attempts to roll the meatballs, and by the time they sat down to eat, it felt like they had taken another small step toward being a real family. But not every moment was easy. The next morning, Graham noticed Jalen sitting quietly by the window, his expression pensive. Graham approached cautiously. "What's on your mind?" he asked, sitting down beside him. Jalen hesitated before speaking. "It's just weird," he said finally. "You're my dad, but I don't really know you. And I don't know if I'm good at this." "At what?" Graham asked gently. Being part of a family, Jalen admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been on my own for so long. What if I mess it up? Graham's heart ached at the boy's words. He placed a reassuring hand on Jalen's shoulder. You're not alone anymore, he said firmly. And there's no right or wrong way to do this. We're figuring it out together. Jalen nodded, but Graham could see the doubt lingering in his eyes. He decided to take a different approach to help Jalen feel more at ease. That afternoon, he introduced Jalen to his own hobby, model building. Graham had a collection of model ships and airplanes, something he had picked up years ago as a way to unwind. You want to help me with this one? Graham asked, holding up a box containing the pieces for a model train set. Jalen's eyes lit up with curiosity. Sure, he said. They spent the next few hours working side by side, carefully assembling the tiny parts. Jalen was meticulous, his natural patience and attention to detail shining through. Graham watched with pride as the boy worked, occasionally cracking a smile at Jalen's focused expression. You're pretty good at this, Graham said. Jalen shrugged but couldn't hide his smile. It's kind of fun. By the time they finished, the train set sat proudly on the table, a small but significant symbol of their teamwork. Graham saw it as more than just a project, it was a step toward building the trust and connection they both craved. As night fell, Jalen began to open up more, sharing stories about his mother. He talked about how she used to read to him every night and how she encouraged his love of history. Graham listened intently, feeling both admiration for Leona and regret for not being there during those years. You have her eyes, Graham said quietly. And her determination. Jalen looked at him, surprised but pleased by the compliment. She always said I got my stubbornness from her. Graham chuckled. Well, I think you might have gotten a little of that from me too. By the end of the day, Graham felt a cautious optimism. It wouldn't happen overnight, but he could see the beginnings of something real between them, a bond that would grow stronger with time and effort. As he tucked Jalen into bed that night, he said, "Good night, son." Jalen hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Good night, Dad." Hearing those words filled Graham with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He knew there would be challenges ahead, but for the first time, he felt ready to face them, not as a judge, but as a father. The following week brought new challenges and opportunities for Graham and Jalen as they continued adjusting to their new reality. Graham was beginning to realize just how much his life had changed. His once quiet house now buzzed with activity, and while it was occasionally chaotic, it was a welcome change from the solitude he had grown used to. One morning, as Graham prepared breakfast, he noticed Jalen sitting at the table with a furrowed brow, staring at his homework. A sheet of math problems lay in front of him, half finished. Need help? Graham asked, setting a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of Jalen. Jalen sighed. It's fractions. I don't get them. Graham sat down beside him, studying the paper. Let's take a look. Fractions can be tricky, but once you break them down, they're not so bad. Over the next 20 minutes, Graham patiently walked Jalen through the problems, using simple examples and metaphors to explain the concepts. Jalen's frustration slowly eased, replaced by cautious understanding. By the time they finished, Jalen managed to solve the final problem on his own. Got it. Jalen said, a grin spreading across his face. See? You're smarter than you think, Graham said, ruffling Jalen's hair. Jalen smiled, the kind of genuine smile Graham was beginning to see more often. It was a small moment, but one that reminded Graham of why he had committed to being a father. Jalen didn't just need a roof over his head, he needed someone to guide him, encourage him, and celebrate his victories, no matter how small. Later that day, Graham received a call from Ms. Johnson, the social worker overseeing Jalen's case. We need to schedule a home visit, she said. It's a standard part of the custody process. I'll also need to interview Jalen and see how he's adjusting. Of course, Graham replied, though the thought of being evaluated made him slightly nervous. He wanted to do everything right, not just for Jalen but to prove to himself that he was capable of this new role. When Graham told Jalen about the upcoming visit, the boy's reaction was less than enthusiastic. "Why do they have to check everything?" Jalen asked, crossing his arms. "It's not like I'm not happy here." "I know," Graham said gently. "But it's their job to make sure this is the right place for you. And I think it's a good opportunity to show them how well we're doing." Jalen hesitated, then shrugged. "Okay. I'll do it, I guess." In the days leading up to the visit, Graham and Jalen worked together to tidy up the house. They organized Jalen's room, adding a few new decorations that reflected his interests, a poster of the pyramids, a model airplane they had built together, and a shelf of history books Graham had picked out for him. When Ms. Johnson arrived for the visit, she was greeted by the sight of Jalen proudly showing off his room. "It's nice," she said, jotting notes on her clipboard. "You've made it your own." Jalen nodded. "Yeah, it's way better than any place I've been before." Ms. Johnson spent the next hour observing their interactions and asking questions. She asked Jalen about his daily routine, how he felt about living with Graham, and whether he felt safe and supported. "It's good here," Jalen said, his voice steady. "He helps me with homework, and he listens when I talk. I didn't have that before." Ms. Johnson then turned to Graham. "How have you adjusted to parenting?" she asked. "It's been a learning experience," Graham admitted, "but one I'm grateful for. Jalen has brought so much to my life. I can't imagine things any other way now." Ms. Johnson nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You've made a lot of progress together. That's clear." After the visit, Graham and Jalen sat on the couch, both relieved the evaluation was over. "You did great," Graham said, handing Jalen a bowl of popcorn. "You think she'll let me stay?" Jalen asked, his tone hesitant. "I don't think," Graham replied. "I know. You're not going anywhere." The reassurance seemed to ease Jalen's worries, and they spent the rest of the evening watching a movie, laughing and joking like they had been a family forever. As Graham tucked Jalen into bed that night, Jalen looked up at him. "Thanks for today," he said softly. "For what?" Graham asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. "For everything," Jalen replied. "For making me feel like I belong." Graham's chest tightened with emotion. "You do belong, Jalen. This is your home now. Always." As he turned off the light and closed the door, Graham couldn't help but smile. They still had a long journey ahead, but moments like these reminded him that every step was worth it. Together, they were building something stronger than either of them had imagined, a family. As the days turned into weeks, Graham and Jalen's bond continued to grow. They had settled into a routine, breakfast together in the mornings, school and work during the day, and evenings spent reading, playing basketball, or working on projects like their ever-growing collection of model airplanes. Life was falling into place, but Graham knew that the road ahead still held challenges. One afternoon, Graham received a call from Ms. Johnson. "The next hearing is scheduled," she informed him. "It will determine whether Jalen's placement with you becomes permanent." Though Graham had been expecting this, hearing it made his heart race. He wanted nothing more than to provide Jalen with the stability and permanence he deserved. But the upcoming hearing was a reminder that the decision wasn't entirely in his hands. That evening, as they sat at the dinner table, Graham decided to bring up the hearing. "Jalen, there's something we need to talk about," he began, setting his fork down. Jalen looked up, his expression wary. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Graham reassured him. "But there's a hearing coming up. It's to decide if you'll stay here permanently." Jalen's eyes widened. "Do I have to do anything? Like talk in court?" "You might have to answer a few questions," Graham said gently. "But you just need to be honest. Tell the judge how you feel." Jalen nodded slowly, but Graham could see the anxiety flickering in his eyes. What if they say no? Jalen asked quietly. They won't, Graham said firmly. You're exactly where you're meant to be. We'll face this together, okay? Jalen didn't respond immediately, but then he gave a small nod. Okay. In the days leading up to the hearing, Graham noticed that Jalen was quieter than usual. He spent more time in his room, sketching in his notebook or reading, but his usual chatter and jokes were absent. Graham decided to find a way to help Jalen release some of the tension. One Saturday morning, Graham woke Jalen early. Get dressed, he said with a grin. We're going on an adventure. Jalen groaned but obeyed, his curiosity piqued. Graham took him to a nearby hiking trail that wound through a forested park. As they walked, the crisp air and the sound of leaves crunching beneath their feet seemed to lighten the mood. This is nice, Jalen admitted as they paused by a stream. I didn't know you liked hiking. I used to come here a lot when I needed to think, Graham said. It always helped me clear my head. Jalen threw a pebble into the stream, watching the ripples spread. Do you think the judge will think I belong here? He asked suddenly. I know she will, Graham said, crouching beside him. But what really matters is how you feel. Do you think you belong here? Jalen hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. I do. Then that's all that matters, Graham said. The rest will fall into place. As they hiked back, Jalen's mood seemed lighter. He started pointing out interesting trees and sharing facts about the forest he had read in one of his books. Graham felt a surge of pride. Jalen was opening up, trusting not just him but the process they were navigating together. The night before the hearing, Graham found Jalen sitting at the dining table, nervously fiddling with his notebook. Can't sleep? Graham asked, sitting down beside him. Jalen shook his head. What if I mess up tomorrow? You won't, Graham said confidently. Just be yourself. That's all anyone can ask. Jalen looked at him, his expression serious. What if I say the wrong thing? What if they don't let me stay? They will, Graham said firmly. But even if things don't go as planned, I won't stop fighting for you. You're my son, Jalen. And I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you know that. Jalen's lips quirked into a small smile. Thanks, Dad. Hearing Jalen call him Dad never failed to hit Graham straight in the heart. Always, he said, placing a reassuring hand on Jalen's shoulder. The next day, as they walked into the courthouse together, Graham could feel Jalen's nerves, but he also saw the determination in the boy's eyes. This was a pivotal moment, one that would determine the course of their future. Graham was ready to fight for Jalen, but most of all, he was ready to stand beside him, no matter what came next. The day of the hearing dawned with an air of anticipation and anxiety. Graham woke early, making breakfast for Jalen while the boy dressed in the suit Graham had bought him for the occasion. As Graham flipped pancakes, he caught sight of Jalen in the doorway, adjusting the tie that seemed just a little too formal for him. You clean up well, Graham said with a smile, hoping to lighten the mood. Jalen smirked but said nothing, nervously fidgeting with the tie. Graham walked over and knelt in front of him, fixing the knot. You look great, Jalen, he said. And you're going to do great today. Jalen nodded, but Graham could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He knew how much this day meant to the boy, how much it meant to both of them. When they arrived at the courthouse, the usual buzz of activity greeted them. Lawyers, clerks, and families moved through the halls, but for Graham, all of it blurred into the background. His focus was entirely on Jalen, who walked beside him with a quiet determination. The courtroom itself was smaller than the ones Graham usually presided over, but its significance felt immense. They took their seats at a table near the front, joined by Ms. Johnson, who offered Jalen a reassuring smile. The judge overseeing the case, a seasoned woman named Judge Elena Morales, entered the room and called the session to order. Graham had met her before in a professional capacity, but today, he was on the other side of the bench, and the shift was humbling. The proceedings began with Ms. Johnson presenting her report. She spoke about Jalen's background, his time in foster care, and the progress he had made since moving in with Graham. She highlighted the bond they had formed and emphasized the stability Graham had provided. Jalen has thrived under Mr. Calloway's care, Ms. Johnson concluded. It's clear that this placement has been beneficial for him, and I believe it's in his best interest to remain with Mr. Calloway permanently. Judge Morales nodded, her expression thoughtful. Thank you, Ms. Johnson. I'd like to hear from Mr. Calloway now. Graham stood, adjusting his tie before addressing the court. He felt a wave of nerves, unusual for him, but pushed through it. Your Honor, he began, I've spent my career making decisions about other people's lives. But nothing has been more important to me than the decision to care for Jalen. He's not just a boy in need of a home, he's my son. Every day, he shows me his resilience, his curiosity, and his capacity for love. I want to provide him with the stability and support he deserves, not just as his guardian, but as his father. Judge Morales listened intently, her face unreadable. Thank you, Mr. Calloway, she said before turning her attention to Jalen. Jalen, would you like to share anything? Jalen hesitated, glancing at Graham, who gave him an encouraging nod. Slowly, Jalen stood, his hands clasped in front of him. I used to think I was on my own, he said quietly, his voice trembling slightly. I didn't think I could trust anyone, because every time I did, they left. But Mr. Calloway, my dad, he's different. He listens. He cares. And he doesn't make me feel like I'm just a kid he has to take care of. He makes me feel like I matter. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of Jalen's words settling over everyone present. Judge Morales leaned forward slightly, her expression softening. Thank you, Jalen. That was very brave of you. Jalen sat down, his face flushed but relieved. Graham placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, silently telling him how proud he was. After a brief recess, Judge Morales returned to deliver her decision. After reviewing the case and hearing from all parties, she began, It's clear to me that this arrangement has provided Jalen with the stability and care he needs. Mr. Calloway has demonstrated his commitment to Jalen's well-being, and it is in Jalen's best interest to remain in his care. I hereby approve the custody arrangement, granting Mr. Calloway full legal guardianship. The room erupted into quiet applause, and Graham exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Jalen turned to him, his eyes wide with disbelief. Does this mean I'm staying? Graham pulled him into a hug, his voice thick with emotion. It means you're home, Jalen. For good. As they left the courthouse, the weight of uncertainty lifted from their shoulders. They were no longer navigating an unknown future, they were a family, officially and forever. Graham couldn't stop smiling as they walked to the car, and for the first time in a long time, Jalen's laughter rang out, clear and carefree. That night, they celebrated with pizza and ice cream, and Jalen insisted on staying up late to watch a movie. As they sat on the couch, Jalen leaned against Graham, a contented smile on his face. Thanks, Dad, Jalen said softly. For what? Graham asked. For not giving up on me. Graham wrapped an arm around his son, his chest swelling with pride and love. Never, he said. Not for a second. The days following the hearing were a whirlwind of emotions for Graham and Jalen. The official approval of their guardianship marked the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope, security, and the promise of a stable future. But with that stability came the task of truly adjusting to their new lives as father and son. Jalen seemed lighter, as though the weight of uncertainty had finally been lifted from his shoulders. He smiled more often, joked more freely, and even began decorating his room to make it uniquely his own. Graham encouraged this, offering to take him shopping for new furniture and posters. Together, They picked out a vibrant blue comforter for Jalen's bed and a shelf to display his growing collection of history books and model planes. One evening, as they were assembling the new shelf, Jalen looked up at Graham with a curious expression. "Did you ever think you'd have a kid?" he asked suddenly. The question caught Graham off guard. He paused, the screwdriver in his hand hovering midair. "Honestly? No," he admitted. "I always thought my career would be my life. I didn't think I'd be any good at being a dad." Jalen tilted his head, studying him. "You're good at it," he said simply. "You care. That's what matters." The words hit Graham harder than he expected. He smiled and ruffled Jalen's hair. "Thanks, kiddo. That means a lot." Their bond deepened over the next few weeks as they fell into a rhythm. Graham continued to learn the ins and outs of parenting, helping Jalen with homework, attending parent-teacher conferences, and showing up for soccer games. At the same time, Jalen began to thrive. His grades improved, and he even joined the school's science club, where he made a few close friends. But their journey wasn't without challenges. One afternoon, Graham received a call from Jalen's teacher, Mrs. Harper. "Jalen got into a fight at school today," she said, her tone concerned. It wasn't physical, but it was heated. Graham's stomach sank. "What happened?" "Another student made a comment about Jalen being in foster care," Mrs. Harper explained. Jalen defended himself, but he was clearly upset. "I thought you should know." When Jalen came home that evening, Graham was waiting for him in the kitchen. Jalen looked wary as he dropped his backpack by the door. "Mrs. Harper called," Graham said gently. Jalen sighed and slumped into a chair. "It wasn't my fault," he muttered. "I'm not saying it was," Graham replied, taking a seat across from him. "But I want to know what happened." Jalen hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "This kid, Logan, said something about me not having a real family," he said finally. "He said I was just a charity case." Graham's jaw tightened, anger bubbling beneath his calm exterior. "What did you say to him?" "I told him he didn't know what he was talking about," Jalen said, his voice defiant. "And I told him I do have a family. I have you." Graham's chest tightened at the boy's words. He reached across the table and placed a reassuring hand on Jalen's. "I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself," he said. "But next time, come to me if something like that happens. You don't have to face it alone." Jalen looked up, his eyes searching Graham's face. "You really mean that?" "Every word," Graham said firmly. "We're a team, remember?" Jalen nodded, a small smile breaking through his frustration. "Yeah. A team." That evening, Graham made a point to talk to Jalen about how to handle tough situations and reminded him that he had nothing to prove to anyone. "What matters is what we know," Graham said. "And we know we're a family." As the weeks passed, Graham began to see more of Jalen's confidence shine through. The boy who had once been guarded and uncertain was now eager to share his thoughts and dreams. Jalen talked about wanting to travel someday, to see the places he had read about in books, Egypt, Greece, Rome. Graham promised they would plan a trip together one day. On a quiet Saturday morning, Jalen surprised Graham by pulling out a scrapbook he had been secretly working on. "I thought it'd be cool to make something about us," Jalen said, handing it to Graham. The scrapbook was filled with photos, ticket stubs, and little notes Jalen had written about their time together, going to the park, building model planes, the day of the hearing. Each page was a testament to the bond they had built. Graham's throat tightened as he flipped through the pages. "This is amazing, Jalen," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Jalen shrugged, a shy smile on his face. "I just wanted to remember it all." "You don't need a book to remember," Graham said, pulling him into a hug. "But this means the world to me." As they sat together, flipping through the pages, Graham realized how far they had come. Their journey had been anything but easy, but it had been worth every challenge. They weren't just a team, they were a family, and they were stronger together than they had ever been apart. As the months turned into a year, Graham and Jalen had fully settled into their life together. What had started as an unexpected revelation in a courtroom had blossomed into something neither of them could have anticipated, a true, loving family. Their home, once quiet and filled with solitude, now echoed with laughter, the shuffle of sneakers on hardwood floors, and the occasional sound of Jalen's favorite music playing from his room. One crisp autumn morning, Graham was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee and reading the newspaper, when Jalen came bounding into the room. His face was lit up with excitement, a piece of paper clutched in his hand. "Dad, you're not going to believe this!" Jalen exclaimed, practically vibrating with energy. Graham looked up with a smile. "What is it, kiddo?" Jalen slapped the paper onto the table. It was a flyer for a school trip to Washington, D.C., where his history class was planning to visit museums and historical landmarks. "They're going to the National Mall and the Smithsonian," Jalen said, his words tumbling over each other. "It's everything I've read about, and I could actually see it in person." Graham chuckled, touched by Jalen's enthusiasm. "That sounds amazing," he said. "When's the trip?" "Next month," Jalen replied, his excitement tempered slightly. "But there's a fee, and I know it's a lot." Graham glanced at the flyer, noting the cost of the trip. It was reasonable, but Jalen's concern showed just how much he still struggled with the idea of asking for things. Graham reached across the table and placed a hand on Jalen's. "Jalen," he said, his voice steady, "you don't have to worry about the cost. This is an incredible opportunity, and I want you to have it. We'll make it work." Jalen's face broke into a wide grin. "Really? You mean it?" "Of course," Graham said. "You've worked hard in school, and you deserve this. Let's get the permission slip filled out today." Jalen threw his arms around Graham in a rare, spontaneous hug. "Thanks, Dad. This is going to be the best trip ever." Over the next few weeks, the anticipation for the trip became a focal point in their household. Graham helped Jalen prepare, buying him a sturdy backpack and a new pair of sneakers for all the walking he'd be doing. They pored over maps of Washington, D.C., with Jalen excitedly pointing out all the places he wanted to see. When the day of the trip arrived, Graham drove Jalen to the school, where a group of students and teachers was gathering by the bus. Jalen was buzzing with excitement, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "Have fun," Graham said, kneeling slightly so they were at eye level. "Take lots of pictures and tell me everything when you get back." "I will," Jalen promised. "Thanks for letting me go." As Jalen boarded the bus, Graham felt a surge of pride. Watching his son wave from the window, he realized just how much Jalen had grown, not just physically, but emotionally. He was thriving in a way Graham hadn't thought possible a year ago. The trip was a resounding success. Jalen returned home with a camera full of photos, a backpack stuffed with souvenirs, and enough stories to fill an entire evening. As they sat at the dining table, Jalen recounted every detail, the monuments, the museums, and even the fun he'd had with his classmates. "That sounds like an amazing experience," Graham said, laughing at one of Jalen's stories about his teacher losing track of the group at the Lincoln Memorial. "It was," Jalen said, his voice softening. "But the best part was knowing I had someone to come home to and tell all about it." Graham's chest tightened at the boy's words. "You'll always have that, Jalen. No matter what." In the weeks that followed, life continued to flourish. Graham's colleagues noticed a newfound lightness in him, a joy that hadn't been there before. And Jalen, once a guarded boy who had faced too much uncertainty, was now thriving in school, building friendships, and dreaming about the future. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a documentary about ancient Egypt, Jalen turned to Graham with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't said anything in court that day?" he asked. Graham looked at him, his face softening. I do, he admitted. And every time, I feel grateful that you were brave enough to speak up. You changed my life, Jalen. Jalen smiled, his eyes shimmering with emotion. You changed mine too. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the flickering light from the TV casting soft shadows across the room. For Graham, this was everything he had never known he needed: a family, a purpose, and a bond that had turned his quiet house into a true home. As the documentary ended, Jalen leaned his head against Graham's shoulder. Thanks for being my dad, he said softly. Thanks for being my son, Graham replied, his voice filled with pride and love. In that moment, Graham knew they had both found something extraordinary in each other. Together, they had faced the unknown, overcome challenges, and built a family that would last a lifetime. It was a journey neither of them had expected, but it was one they would cherish forever.